James Carter drove down the busy street, his hands gripping the well-worn steering wheel of his old pickup truck. The sun beat down on the hood of the vehicle, causing a slight shimmer in the heat, but James didn't pay much attention to that. His focus was entirely on what lay ahead. The dealership he had been eyeing for months was only a few blocks away, and with each passing street, his anticipation grew. He could feel the subtle vibration of the truck's engine beneath him, its faint rumble a constant reminder of just how long he had driven this machine. Over a decade of service, miles upon miles, battles fought, memories made. And while it had always been reliable, today would mark the beginning of something new. For the past several months, James had allowed himself to dream, something he rarely did. He had spent his life focused on service, both to his country and to his family. Sacrifice was something he knew well, and indulgence wasn't in his nature. But now, at this stage in his life, he felt like he had earned the right to something more, something that wasn't just practical, but symbolic of everything he had worked for. A luxury car. Not just any car, but a sleek, powerful convertible that he had seen online countless times, imagining what it would feel like to sit behind the wheel. He could already picture it, the wind rushing past him as he cruised down the highway, the sun on his face, and a sense of freedom that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the car itself, it was about what it represented. A new chapter in his life, one where he could finally focus on himself for a change. The thought brought a slight smile to his face as he turned onto the dealership street. The building came into view, its modern glass facade gleaming in the sunlight. It was a stunning structure, all sharp lines and polished surfaces, designed to impress. Rows of high-end cars were parked outside, each one shining like a jewel on display. The sight of them filled James with a quiet sense of excitement. This was what he had been working toward, a moment where he could walk into a place like this and know he belonged there. As he approached the entrance, James cast a glance at his reflection in the glass. He looked exactly like he always did: worn jeans, a faded military jacket that had seen better days, and boots that had walked through countless miles of dust and dirt. His appearance was a far cry from the polished, tailored suits he imagined most of the dealership's clientele wore. But that didn't bother him. He had learned long ago that appearance didn't define worth. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind that came from experience rather than outward presentation. Pulling into the lot, James found a spot near the front. His truck, with its faded paint and slightly dented sides, stood out starkly against the pristine vehicles surrounding it. He turned off the engine, the soft purr of the motor fading into silence, and took a deep breath. This was it. Today was the day he had been waiting for. He stepped out of the truck, the familiar creak of the door echoing in his ears as he closed it behind him. The warm summer air hit him instantly, and he adjusted the brim of his cap slightly to shield his eyes from the sun. For a moment he stood still, taking in the sight before him: the towering dealership, the gleaming cars, the polished glass windows that reflected the world outside like a mirror. It was an impressive sight, and for a brief second, James felt a pang of uncertainty. Did he really belong here? Was he really ready for this? But he quickly pushed those thoughts aside. He had come too far to turn back now. Besides, he wasn't the type to let anything, especially self-doubt, stand in his way. Squaring his shoulders, James walked toward the entrance, his boots making a soft thud against the pavement. The automatic glass doors slid open with a quiet whoosh as he stepped inside, and the first thing that hit him was the cool blast of air conditioning. The stark contrast between the warm, sunny day outside and the chilled, polished interior of the dealership was almost disorienting for a moment. But James quickly regained his bearings, his eyes scanning the space around him. The dealership was everything he had imagined: high ceilings, bright lights, and an unmistakable air of luxury. Sleek, modern furniture lined the waiting area, and the walls were adorned with framed photos of satisfied customers posing with their new cars. In the center of it all, rows of luxury vehicles were displayed like works of art, each one carefully positioned under spotlights that highlighted their every curve and detail. It was a far cry from the utilitarian military vehicles James had spent so many years driving, but he couldn't deny the appeal.
As he walked further into the showroom, he noticed a few salespeople milling about. They were dressed sharply, in crisp suits and polished shoes, their hair neatly styled and their expressions carefully composed. James caught their eyes briefly as he passed, and while they offered polite smiles, he could sense the subtle shift in their demeanor. It was a feeling he had experienced many times before: the quick, silent judgment based on his appearance. They were sizing him up, making assumptions about whether or not he belonged in a place like this.
James wasn't surprised. He knew exactly what they were thinking. To them, he was just another guy off the street, someone who probably couldn't afford even the down payment on one of these cars. But he didn't let it bother him. He had been underestimated before, and he had learned long ago not to take it personally. Besides, today wasn't about proving anything to them, it was about proving something to himself. He made his way to the center of the showroom, his eyes landing on the car he had come for. There it was, the convertible he had been dreaming about for months. It was even more stunning in person than it had been in the photos. The sleek, aerodynamic design, the glossy finish, the way the light played off its surface, it was everything he had imagined and more. For a moment, James just stood there, taking it all in. But as he approached the car, he couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in the air. The salespeople were watching him more closely now, their polite smiles fading into something more calculating. He knew what was coming, and he braced himself for it. Still, he wasn't going to let anyone ruin this moment for him. He had earned this, and no matter what they thought of him, he was here to buy this car. James approached the convertible with the same steady, confident stride that had carried him through countless challenging situations in his life. He had made up his mind, and no amount of polite smiles or dismissive glances would change that. This car was his goal, and today he intended to drive it home. The convertible gleamed under the overhead lights, its sleek, metallic surface seeming to invite him closer. It was the kind of car that turned heads, that made a statement. And while James had never been one for showing off, there was something deeply satisfying about the idea of owning something so undeniably beautiful. As he reached out to run his hand along the side of the car, admiring the smooth curve of the body, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir, can I help you with something?" James turned to see a young salesman approaching him. The man, who couldn't have been more than 25, was impeccably dressed in a sharp suit and a brightly colored tie that looked like it cost more than James's entire outfit. His hair was slicked back with precision, and his expression, though polite, had a hint of something else, a slight smirk that betrayed his true feelings. He clearly didn't expect James to be a serious customer. Yet James replied, his voice calm and measured. "I'm interested in this convertible. I'd like to take a look at the specs and talk about purchasing options."
The salesman, his name tag read red, paused for a moment as if processing the words. His eyes flicked briefly over James's worn jeans and faded jacket, and James could almost see the calculations happening in his head. The smile on Rick's face remained fixed, but it didn't reach his eyes.
"That's a fantastic model," Sir Rick said, his voice carrying the same practiced cheer that James had heard in 100 different sales pitches over the years. "But, maybe we should look at some other options first, something more within your range." James felt the subtle jab, the insinuation hidden beneath the salesman's words. He wasn't surprised. This was exactly the kind of interaction he had been expecting since he walked through the doors. But that didn't make it any less infuriating. Still, he kept his composure. He wasn't here to argue, he was here to buy a car. "I'm pretty sure this is the one I'm looking for," James replied, his voice steady. "I've been researching it for a while. I'd like to know the price." Rick hesitated, his smirk deepening slightly. "Well, it's not just about the price, sir. I mean, this is a top-of-the-line model. It's going to be pretty expensive, and we have some great deals on pre-owned vehicles that might be a better fit. Why don't I show you a few of those?" James's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't let his frustration show. Instead, he looked Rick straight in the eye and said, "I'm paying in cash." That, James thought, would put an end to the condescending tone. Cash was king in situations like this, right? But instead of being impressed, Rick seemed more amused. His smirk widened, and there was a momentary flicker of disbelief in his eyes, as if he thought James was joking.
"Oh, I see," Rick said, his tone dripping with forced politeness. "Well, that's great. But even so, why don't we take a look at some of our other vehicles first? I think you'll find they're a bit more accessible."
It was clear now that Rick didn't believe him. James could feel the tension rising in his chest, a slow burn that he had become all too familiar with over the years. It wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about him based on how he looked, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But that didn't mean he was going to let it slide. "I'm not interested in pre-owned models," James said, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm interested in this car. Can you get me someone who can help with that?" Rick's smile faltered slightly, but before he could respond, another figure approached. This man was older, in his early 40s, with a slick, polished appearance that screamed corporate professionalism. His suit was more expensive than Rick's, and his demeanor was far more practiced. He extended a hand toward James, a wide, toothy smile on his face. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm Carl, one of the senior sales representatives here. I understand you're interested in our convertible." His voice was smooth, almost too smooth, and James immediately sensed that Carl had been brought in to handle the situation. James shook his hand, noting the overly firm grip. "That's right. I've been looking at this model for a while, and I'm ready to make an offer." Carl's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, disbelief, perhaps, or maybe just the assumption that James wasn't serious. Either way, Carl wasn't about to let it show. "Well, that's wonderful to hear. But that's one of our more premium models," Carl said, his tone still overly polite. "Why don't we take a look at some of our pre-owned options? We've got some great deals right now, and I'm sure we can find something that fits your needs." James felt his patience wearing thin. He had been calm, polite, and direct, but it was becoming clear that these men had no intention of taking him seriously. It wasn't just about the car anymore, it was about something deeper, something James had faced time and time again. "I'm not here to look at pre-owned cars," James said, his voice low but firm. "I'm here to buy this one." Carl glanced at Rick, a barely perceptible exchange passing between them. It was the look of two men who thought they were dealing with someone who was wasting their time. But Carl, ever the professional, kept his smile in place. "Well, that's great to hear," Sir Carl said, his tone still overly pleasant. "But unfortunately, this car has been reserved for another customer." James knew it was a lie the moment the words left Carl's mouth. He had seen the way Rick had reacted when he first mentioned paying in cash, the way they had both subtly dismissed him. This was a stalling tactic, an excuse to get him to leave without making a scene. "Reserved," James repeated, his voice calm, but with an edge of disbelief. "I didn't see a sign saying it was reserved." Carl's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Well, it's not something we typically advertise, but the car is definitely on hold for another client. Why don't I show you some other models in the meantime?" Before James could respond, he noticed another couple entering the dealership. They were young, well-dressed, and clearly wealthy, the kind of customers who would be taken seriously without question. Carl and Rick immediately shifted their attention toward them, as if James had suddenly become invisible. The couple was ushered directly toward the convertible, the very car James had been discussing, and given the full sales pitch. It was a slap in the face, but James didn't react. He had learned long ago that getting angry wouldn't help his situation. Instead, he watched quietly as the couple admired the car, listening to Carl's enthusiastic description of its features. The entire interaction was infuriating, but James held his ground. Carl eventually returned to James, his smile still in place but his demeanor slightly more rushed. "So as I was saying, we've got some great deals on other models. Let me show you a few of them." But James wasn't about to back down. He had come here with a goal, and he wasn't going to let these men push him aside. "I'll wait for the manager," James said, his tone calm but resolute. Carl's smile wavered, but he quickly regained his composure. "Of course, sir. I'll be right back." As Carl disappeared into the back of the dealership, James took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He had been through worse situations in his life, but there was something about the casual dismissal he had just experienced that gnawed at him. It wasn't just about the car anymore, it was about respect. A few minutes passed before Carl returned, and with him came Linda, the dealership's manager. She was a woman in her 50s, with a no-nonsense expression and an air of authority. Unlike Rick and Carl, she didn't bother with a smile. Instead, she looked James up and down, clearly assessing him. "Mr. Carter, I understand you're interested in one of our vehicles," Linda said, her tone professional but distant. "That's right," James replied, his voice steady. "I've been looking at the convertible, but I've been told it's reserved." Linda glanced at Carl, who nodded slightly, confirming the story. "Yes, that particular model is currently on hold for another client," Linda said. "But we do have other options available that I think you'll find more suitable." James felt his frustration rising again. It was the same story, over and over. They weren't taking him seriously, and they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. "I'd like to speak to the owner," James said, his voice firm. Linda raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the request, but she nodded curtly. "I'll see what I can do. Please wait here." James stood in the middle of the dealership's gleaming showroom, watching as Linda disappeared into the back offices. His patience was wearing thin, and the faint buzzing of the air conditioning in the quiet, polished space only amplified the tension building inside him. The subtle sound of his own breath, measured and controlled, kept him calm on the surface, but underneath, frustration was beginning to bubble. He had walked into this dealership knowing what he wanted. He had done his research, saved his money, and even mentally prepared himself for the possibility of some skepticism. After all, he wasn't dressed like the typical luxury car buyer. His old military jacket and jeans stood out against the backdrop of tailored suits and designer outfits that the dealership's usual clientele wore. But this wasn't just skepticism. This was blatant disrespect, and it was something he wasn't willing to let slide. As he stood by the convertible, the car's sleek lines reflecting the soft overhead lights, James noticed the other couple still lingering nearby. The young, wealthy pair seemed oblivious to the tension, laughing and chatting with Carl and Rick as they admired the same car James had been eyeing. Carl was in full sales mode now, his face lit up with enthusiasm as he listed off the car's features to the couple. It was as if James no longer existed in their world. The couple looked like they had stepped out of a magazine ad, she in a designer dress and oversized sunglasses, he in a tailored blazer with slick back hair. They moved with the easy confidence of people who had never been questioned or underestimated. It was a sharp contrast to James, who had spent a lifetime proving himself in every room he walked into. James clenched his fists briefly, the feeling of being brushed aside stinging more than he cared to admit. He wasn't used to feeling invisible. His entire life had been about taking up space, about making his presence known, whether in the military or back home. This was no different. He wasn't going to let them ignore him. After what felt like an eternity, Linda reappeared, her expression neutral as she approached James. She held a tablet in her hand, which she glanced at as if to confirm something before speaking. "I've spoken with the owner," she said, her tone still professional but colder now, as if the decision had already been made before the conversation had even started. "Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, this vehicle is no longer available. However, we would be happy to offer you a discount on one of our other models. Perhaps something more practical." James narrowed his eyes slightly, the calm exterior beginning to crack just enough for a flash of frustration to show. "More practical," he repeated, his voice low and steady. "I'm here to buy this car, and I'm paying in cash. So unless it's truly unavailable, I don't see why we need to keep discussing other models." Linda pursed her lips, clearly annoyed that James wasn't taking the hint. Behind her, Rick and Carl were still hovering nearby, watching the interaction closely. The wealthy couple had moved on, now inspecting another car with Rick eagerly at their side, but Carl remained, his eyes flicking between Linda and James. "The car is not available, Mr. Carter," Linda said again, her tone sharp. "As I mentioned, it's been reserved for another client. Now, if you'd like, I can show you." Before she could finish, a voice interrupted them. "Is everything all right here?" James turned to see another customer approaching, a tall, older man in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and influence. His hair was silver, and he carried himself with the air of someone who expected people to cater to him. The man's eyes darted between James and Linda, taking in the situation with a raised eyebrow. Linda stiffened immediately, her posture straightening as she turned to the newcomer. "Yes, Mr. Henderson, everything is fine. We were just discussing vehicle availability with Mr. Carter." James didn't miss the slight hesitation in her voice when she said his name. There was a subtle shift in the way she spoke to the older man, a respect that hadn't been there when she was talking to James. It was a small thing, but it was enough to confirm what James had already suspected. This wasn't just about a car. This was about who they thought deserved their attention, their respect, and ultimately, their business. Mr. Henderson glanced at James, his gaze lingering for a moment, before turning back to Linda. "You're not selling him the convertible, are you?" Linda hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of the question. "Well, as I mentioned, that vehicle is currently reserved." Mr. Henderson waved a hand dismissively, cutting her off mid-sentence. "No need to explain. I understand. Just make sure you reserve the good stuff for the right people. Yeah." James felt the words like a punch to the gut. The insinuation was as clear as day. Mr. Henderson wasn't just questioning James's ability to buy the car, he was questioning whether James even belonged in the dealership in the first place. It was the same old story, one James had heard 100 times before. The only difference now was that it was happening in public, with no attempt to hide it behind fake smiles or polite excuses. Linda, sensing the tension, cleared her throat awkwardly. Mr. Henderson, we value all our customers equally, she said, her voice tight. James let out a short, humorless laugh. Do you? The question hung in the air for a moment, the weight of it sinking in as both Linda and Mr. Henderson turned to look at him. There was a beat of silence, and then Mr. Henderson chuckled softly, shaking his head. Look, son, Mr. Henderson said, his tone patronizing. I've been buying cars from this dealership for years. They know how to take care of their best customers. Maybe you should focus on something more, within your reach. James felt a familiar burn of anger rising in his chest. It was the same patronizing tone he had heard so many times in his life, the same condescending attitude that assumed he didn't belong, that he wasn't worthy of the same respect as others. But today, he wasn't going to let it slide. I've got enough reach to buy that car, James said, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge. In cash. Mr. Henderson blinked, surprised by the firmness in James's tone. For a moment he seemed caught off guard, but then he smirked. Cash, huh? That's cute. But like I said, this dealership knows how to take care of its best customers. James stared at him, his expression unreadable, but inside, the anger was building. He wasn't going to cause a scene. He wasn't going to let them push him into that corner. But he also wasn't going to walk away quietly.
Just as Mr. Henderson opened his mouth to say something else, James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen and saw a familiar name flashing across it, General Thompson, his old commanding officer, and a man with more influence than anyone in this dealership realized.
James stepped back slightly, holding up a finger as he answered the call. General, sir. Carter. Where are you? The general's voice was brisk, as usual, but there was an unmistakable tone of concern. I'm at the dealership, James replied, glancing at Linda and Mr. Henderson, who were watching him closely, trying to buy a car. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then the general's voice came through, sharp and to the point. What's the problem? James hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to make this a bigger deal than it already was, but at the same time he knew the general wouldn't be calling unless it was important. Nothing I can't handle, sir. Just a bit of misunderstanding. Another pause, and then the general spoke again, his voice lower but more forceful. I'll handle it. Stay there. The call ended abruptly, and James slipped the phone back into his pocket. He wasn't entirely sure what the general had in mind, but he had learned long ago to trust him. Whatever was about to happen, it was out of James's hands now. Linda, sensing the shift in the conversation, cleared her throat again. Mr. Carter, I really do think we can find something more suitable for you. We have a wide selection of vehicles. Before she could finish, her phone rang. She glanced down at the screen, her expression faltering for just a moment before she answered. Linda speaking, she said, her voice clipped. As she listened to whoever was on the other end, her face changed. The confident, slightly dismissive tone she had been using with James was gone, replaced by a look of sudden realization. She glanced at James, then at Mr. Henderson, her lips pressed into a thin line. Yes, sir, she said into the phone, her tone now noticeably more respectful. Of course. Right away. She ended the call and turned back to James, her expression now entirely different from the one she had worn before. There was no more condescension, no more thinly veiled dismissiveness. Instead, there was something almost resembling fear. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice softer now. I wasn't aware of your connections. Let me personally assist you with the purchase of the convertible. James stood in silence for a moment, processing Linda's sudden change in demeanor. Her earlier indifference had evaporated, replaced with a nervous eagerness to please. It was a stark contrast to how she had treated him just moments before. He knew this shift wasn't due to some newfound respect for him personally, it was because of the power and influence of his commanding officer, General Thompson. But that didn't sit right with him. He hadn't asked for any favors, and he didn't want to be treated differently just because someone else had intervened on his behalf. Linda, now with a tense smile on her face, gestured toward the convertible that had been the center of the entire ordeal. Mr. Carter, I apologize for any misunderstanding earlier. The car is of course available and I'd be happy to finalize the sale for you personally. Her words were smooth, but James could hear the underlying tension. This wasn't a sincere apology, it was damage control. The phone call she had received had clearly rattled her, and now she was scrambling to fix the situation before it escalated further. James could see right through it, and the hollow apology only deepened his frustration. I thought the car was reserved, James said, his voice measured but firm. He wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. Linda hesitated, glancing down at the tablet in her hands as if searching for an answer. There seems to have been a mistake. We had some miscommunication internally, but I assure you the car is available now.
James raised an eyebrow, watching her closely. A mistake? Or was it just easier to show me the door?
Linda flinched slightly at the accusation, but she quickly recovered, her professional mask slipping back into place. We value all of our customers, Mr. Carter, she said, though her voice lacked the confidence it had earlier.
James didn't respond right away. He glanced over at Carl and Rick, who were standing off to the side, watching the exchange with a mix of confusion and discomfort. They had clearly expected the situation to end with James being quietly shown out, and now they were scrambling to figure out how things had gone so wrong. Carl's forced smile had disappeared, and Rick was avoiding eye contact altogether, clearly embarrassed by the turn of events.
As James looked back at Linda, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was about respect, or more accurately, the lack of it. He had been dismissed, patronized, and underestimated from the moment he had walked through the doors. And now, only because of a phone call from someone with power, they were suddenly eager to treat him like a valued customer. Before James could decide how to respond, another voice cut through the tension. I knew it. Ye? James turned to see Mr. Henderson still standing nearby, his arms crossed and a smug expression on his face. He had been watching the entire exchange unfold, and now that Linda had changed her tune, he seemed more amused than anything. I knew there was something off, Mr. Henderson said, his voice dripping with condescension. You didn't really think you could walk in here and buy a car like this, did you? Not without pulling some strings.
James felt his patience stretch thin, but he remained calm, keeping his expression neutral. He wasn't going to let this man get to him, no matter how much he wanted to snap back. Mr. Carter is perfectly within his rights to purchase this vehicle, Linda said quickly, clearly trying to smooth things over before the situation escalated further.
Mr. Henderson scoffed. Oh, I'm sure he is now, with his little phone call to a higher-up. Must be nice to have friends in high places. The smugness in his voice was infuriating, but James remained steady. He had been through worse confrontations in his life. This was nothing compared to what he had dealt with in the military. But still, there was something about the way Mr. Henderson looked at him, the way he spoke down to him, that made James want to set the record straight. I didn't call anyone to get special treatment, James said, his voice even. I came here to buy a car. That's it. Mr. Henderson smirked. Right, sure. And you just happened to have a general on speed dial to make sure you got what you wanted. James could feel the tension in the room thickening, and he could sense that the other customers and staff were beginning to notice the confrontation. But he wasn't going to let Mr. Henderson push him into an argument. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, "The only thing I asked for was respect. That doesn't take a phone call." The words hung in the air for a moment, and James could see the flash of irritation on Mr. Henderson's face. The older man wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he clearly considered beneath him. Linda, sensing the growing tension, quickly stepped in again. "Mr. Carter, why don't we go ahead and move forward with the paperwork? I'd be happy to personally assist you with any details." But before James could respond, another unexpected twist unfolded. The front doors of the dealership swung open, and a small group of people entered. At first, James didn't pay much attention, but then he realized who they were. It was a news crew, a reporter, a cameraman, and a sound technician, all carrying equipment and moving with purpose. Linda's eyes widened in alarm as she saw them. "What's going on here?" she muttered under her breath, clearly caught off guard by the sudden arrival.
The reporter, a woman in her 30s with sharp features and a determined expression, approached the group with a microphone in hand. She glanced at James briefly, then turned to Linda. "We're here to do a story on Mr. Carter," the reporter said, her tone brisk and professional. "I believe he's making a significant purchase today." James felt a wave of confusion wash over him. He hadn't called the media, and he certainly hadn't expected a news crew to show up at the dealership. But as the reporter spoke, it became clear that this was no coincidence. Linda's face paled slightly as she realized what was happening. "I wasn't aware of any media presence," she said, her voice faltering. The reporter smiled tightly. "We were tipped off by someone close to the situation."
Apparently, Mr. Carter is a decorated veteran, and we thought his story would make for a compelling segment. James glanced down at his phone, suddenly realizing that the general must have been behind this. He hadn't just made a call to the dealership, he had gone above and beyond, pulling strings to bring the media into the mix. It was the kind of bold move that the general was known for, but it wasn't what James had wanted. The reporter turned to James, her microphone poised. "Mr. Carter, would you mind telling us a little about your experience here today? How does it feel to be making such a significant purchase after everything you've been through?" James blinked, caught off guard by the sudden attention. He hadn't expected to be the center of a media story, and he certainly wasn't prepared to give an interview. But now, with the cameras rolling and the reporter waiting expectantly, he realized that he was in the spotlight whether he liked it or not. He glanced over at Linda, who looked like she was on the verge of panicking. Her carefully composed professionalism had crumbled, and now she was scrambling to figure out how to salvage the situation. Carl and Rick were standing off to the side, looking equally uncomfortable, their earlier smugness gone. James took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. He hadn't come here for attention, he had come here for a car. But now that the media was involved, there was no turning back. He had a platform, and he could use it to say something that mattered. "I didn't come here looking for a story," James said, his voice steady as he addressed the reporter. "I came here to buy a car, just like anyone else. But it's clear that not everyone gets treated the same when they walk through these doors."
The reporter's eyes lit up, sensing the tension in his words. "Are you saying you were discriminated against?"
James hesitated. He didn't want to make this about race or class or any of the other labels that people often use to divide one another. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore what had happened here today. He had been judged from the moment he walked in, not for what he had in his wallet, but for what he looked like. "I'm saying that respect should be given to everyone," James said carefully, "no matter what they look like or where they come from. That's all I was asking for." The reporter nodded, clearly eager to dig deeper into the story. But before she could ask another question, Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his expression darkening.
"This is ridiculous," he muttered, glaring at the news crew. "Turning this into a media circus just because someone got their feelings hurt. It's pathetic."
James felt the anger rise again, but he kept his cool. He wasn't going to let Mr. Henderson bait him into an argument. Instead, he turned to the reporter and said, "This isn't about feelings. It's about fairness." The reporter nodded, sensing that there was more to the story. "Mr. Carter, thank you for your time. We'll be following up on this." As the news crew began to pack up their equipment, Linda stepped forward again, her voice shaky. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for the way things have been handled today. If there's anything we can do to make it right." James held up a hand, cutting her off. "I don't need special treatment. I just need to be treated with the same respect as anyone else." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving Linda, Carl, Rick, and Mr. Henderson standing in stunned silence. The convertible, once the center of his attention, no longer mattered. This was about more than a car now. It was about standing up for himself, and for everyone else who had ever been treated as less. James had barely made it out the door when his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and saw the general's name flashing once more. He stepped outside into the warm sunlight, the tension of the dealership fading as the fresh air hit his face. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he answered the call, already knowing that this conversation would bring yet another unexpected turn to his day. "General," James said, keeping his voice low. He didn't want anyone from the dealership overhearing the conversation, though at this point, with the media involved, it felt like things were already spiraling out of control. "Carter, what the hell happened in there?" The general's voice was sharp, commanding, but there was an undertone of concern. James had known General Thompson for years. They had served together, been through hell together. The general was more than just a commanding officer, he was a friend, though he carried that friendship with the same no-nonsense attitude that had defined his military career. "It's handled," Sir James replied, his voice calm but firm. He didn't want the general thinking he couldn't take care of himself. "I was just trying to buy a car, but things got complicated." Complicated? The general's voice hardened. "That's putting it mildly. I just got a call from someone at the dealership, and now there's a media crew on site? Care to explain how we went from you buying a car to this?" James sighed, running a hand over his face. "I didn't ask for the media, sir. That wasn't part of the plan." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and James could almost picture the general frowning in thought. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer, more measured. "I know you didn't. That was me. I made the call." James blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "You called the media."
Damn right I did. After hearing what was going on, I figured it was time someone shined a light on this kind of nonsense. You shouldn't have to deal with this kind of treatment, not after everything you've done, everything you've been through.
James felt a wave of mixed emotions wash over him. On one hand, he appreciated the general's loyalty, his willingness to stand up for him, to make sure he was treated with the respect he deserved. But on the other hand, James hadn't asked for any of this. He didn't want to be in the spotlight, didn't want to turn a car purchase into a media spectacle. All he had wanted was a simple transaction, but now the situation had spiraled into something much larger, something far beyond his control. "I get it," Sir James said carefully. "But I didn't come here for attention. I just wanted to buy the car, same as anyone else." The general let out a soft chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Carter, you've never been same as anyone else. You're a decorated veteran, a damn hero. You deserve better than what they gave you today." James paused, feeling the weight of those words. It wasn't the first time the general had called him a hero, but every time he heard it, it felt undeserved. He had done his duty, served his country, and while he was proud of his service, he didn't see himself as anything more than a man who had done what needed to be done. "I appreciate that," General James replied, his voice softening. "But I don't want to make this about me. I just wanted them to treat me like they'd treat anyone else."
And they didn't, the general snapped, his frustration clear. "That's the point. They saw a black man in a military jacket and figured you weren't worth their time. They tried to brush you off, and now they're scrambling because they got caught. Well, too bad for them. They made their bed."
James let the silence stretch out for a moment, contemplating the situation. He knew the general meant well, he always had. But James wasn't sure how he felt about the situation escalating this far. It wasn't just about him anymore. The media would likely spin the story into something much bigger, something James hadn't intended. As if reading his thoughts, the general spoke again, his tone softening slightly. "Look, Carter, I know you're not the type to make a fuss, but sometimes you've got to fight back. And if you're not going to do it for yourself, do it for everyone else who gets treated like they don't belong." James looked out at the busy street, cars zooming past, people going about their day, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded inside the dealership. The general was right, this wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had been dismissed, ignored, or treated as less because of how they looked, what they wore, or where they came from. Maybe this was a moment where standing up for himself would mean standing up for all of them. Before James could respond, the general's voice cut through the silence again. "Anyway, you've got more company headed your way. I made a few more calls." James frowned. "More calls?" "Yep. There's a state senator who owes me a favor, and he's on his way down there now. He'll make sure they know this isn't just some media story that'll blow over. You're getting that car, and they're going to regret every second they made you wait." James's stomach tightened at the thought of yet another powerful figure descending on the dealership. This wasn't what he had wanted. He hadn't come here looking for revenge or to make anyone regret anything. He had simply wanted to be treated with respect, like any other customer. "General, I'm not sure this is necessary." "It's already in motion," Carter the general interrupted. "Just sit tight. They'll have no choice but to play nice now." James let out a slow breath, knowing there was no stopping what was about to happen. The general's word was law in situations like this, and when he decided something was going to happen, it happened. There was no arguing with him, and James knew better than to try. "I'll handle it," James said finally, resigning himself to the situation. "I know you will," the general replied, his voice softening again. "And Carter, don't let them push you around. Not now, not ever." The call ended, and James stood on the sidewalk, staring at his phone for a moment. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. He hadn't asked for this, but now it was his reality. The general had made sure of that. James slipped his phone back into his pocket and turned to face the dealership. The large glass windows reflected the scene inside. Linda was standing near the desk, her face pale and tense as she spoke with Carl and Rick. They were clearly rattled, no longer the confident salespeople they had been when James first walked in. Now, They were scrambling to salvage the situation, knowing that it had spiraled far beyond a simple car sale. As James walked back inside, the cool blast of air conditioning hit him once more, but this time, the atmosphere felt different. The quiet murmur of the showroom was laced with an undercurrent of tension. The other customers had noticed the media presence, the awkwardness in the air, and were beginning to whisper among themselves. Linda saw James re-enter and immediately approached him, her smile tight and forced. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry for the confusion earlier. We're ready to move forward with your purchase. I'll personally oversee everything to ensure it goes smoothly." Her words were smooth, but James could see the cracks in her composure. She was clearly nervous, her earlier confidence completely shaken. The media attention, the calls from higher-ups, it had all thrown her off balance, and now she was desperate to make things right. "I'm not sure it's that simple anymore," James said, his voice calm but firm. Linda blinked, her smile faltering slightly. "I don't understand. We've sorted everything out." James held up a hand, cutting her off. "This isn't just about the car anymore. It's about how I was treated the second I walked through those doors." Linda swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the media crew that was still lingering nearby. She knew the eyes of the world were on her now, and there was no escaping the scrutiny. I apologize, Mr. Carter," she stammered, clearly flustered. "It wasn't our intention to make you feel disrespected," James finished for her, his voice quiet but sharp. "Because that's exactly what happened." Linda's face flushed, and she nodded quickly. "Yes, of course, and I take full responsibility. We value all of our customers equally, and I'm truly sorry for the way things were handled earlier." James stared at her for a long moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. He wasn't sure if she truly understood what she had done, or if she was just saying what she thought needed to be said to salvage the situation. Either way, the apology felt hollow. "Apologies don't fix everything," James said finally. "But actions do." Linda nodded, eager to move forward. "Absolutely, Mr. Carter. We'll make sure you're taken care of." As she turned to lead James toward the desk where the paperwork awaited, the doors to the dealership swung open once more. This time, a well-dressed man in a tailored suit entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. The state senator, no doubt. He was accompanied by a small entourage, and his gaze immediately locked onto James. "Mr. Carter," the senator said, his voice smooth and authoritative as he approached. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard a lot about you." James resisted the urge to sigh. This was turning into far more of an ordeal than he had ever imagined. But now, with the media, the senator, and the dealership all wrapped up in the situation, there was no going back. "Senator," James replied with a nod, keeping his tone respectful but distant. The senator extended his hand, and James shook it, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him once more. This wasn't just about a car anymore. It had become a symbol of something much larger, something that James hadn't intended but now had no choice but to navigate. The moment the senator stepped into the dealership, James could feel the air shift once more. Everything that had happened so far had been building toward this moment, a tipping point that seemed inevitable now. The state senator, with his perfectly tailored suit, his entourage in tow, and an air of authority that silenced the room, represented the final step in a conflict that had started with a simple purchase and escalated into a full-blown public affair. James could see Linda out of the corner of his eye, standing awkwardly near the desk, her face pale and her posture stiff. This was no longer just about a customer and a car. It was about power, influence, and the stark reality of how people were treated based on assumptions and appearances. He could tell Linda knew she had lost control of the situation entirely, and there was no undoing what had already been set into motion. "Mr. Carter," the senator repeated, walking toward James with a broad, practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's an honor to meet you." James shook his hand, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him more heavily than ever. This was not how he had envisioned his day. He hadn't wanted the spotlight, hadn't wanted the media attention, and certainly hadn't wanted to become a symbol for something larger than himself. But now, with the cameras rolling, the senator standing in front of him, and the dealership staff anxiously watching from the sidelines, he realized there was no turning back. The senator's grip was firm, his smile unwavering as he addressed James directly, but his voice carried a tone that felt rehearsed, as if he had given this speech countless times before. "I heard about the situation here, and I want to personally apologize on behalf of the community. What happened today was unacceptable." James let go of the senator's hand and nodded, though he kept his expression neutral. The senator's words, while polite, carried the same weight as Linda's earlier apology, empty and scripted. He didn't care for the politics of the situation or the public show of contrition. What mattered to him was the principle of respect, something that couldn't be scripted or manufactured. The senator glanced briefly at the news crew, then back at James. He seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, though whether he genuinely cared or was simply trying to manage the optics was anyone's guess. "I'd like to make sure we correct this mistake and ensure you get the service you deserve." James folded his arms across his chest, maintaining his calm demeanor but feeling the tension building inside him. "Senator, I appreciate the gesture, but this was never about service. It was about respect. That's something you can't just correct with an apology or a few handshakes." The senator hesitated, caught off guard by James's directness. For a moment, the smooth politician facade wavered, and his eyes flicked toward Linda, as if looking for backup. But Linda was too shaken to respond, her own nerves clearly frayed by the presence of the senator and the media. She stood by the sales desk, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as though she were holding on for dear life. The news crew, sensing the tension, moved in closer, their camera now focused squarely on James and the senator. The reporter's eyes gleamed with anticipation, clearly ready to capture whatever was about to unfold next. James could feel the pressure mounting. Everyone was waiting for him to say something, to take a stand, to give them the story they wanted. But James wasn't interested in playing to the cameras. He wasn't here to give anyone a headline. All he had wanted was to buy a car and be treated with the same respect as any other customer. And now, thanks to the general's intervention, that simple goal had turned into something much larger than he had anticipated. The senator cleared his throat, his composure returning as he attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Of course. Respect is key, and I can assure you, Mr. Carter, we are taking steps to ensure that everyone who walks through these doors is treated with the utmost respect, regardless of their background or appearance." James raised an eyebrow, sensing the political maneuvering in the senator's words. The man was trying to shift the conversation away from what had actually happened, attempting to smooth over the entire situation without truly addressing the root of the issue. It was a common tactic: talk about change, make promises, and hope that the spotlight would eventually move on. But James wasn't about to let that happen. "This isn't about promises," Senator James said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about accountability. What happened today isn't an isolated incident. It's something that happens to people every day, in places like this, because of the way they look, or the way they're dressed, or because someone assumes they don't belong. You can talk about respect all you want. But until people are held accountable for their actions, nothing will change." The senator's face tightened, though he quickly covered it with another smile. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Carter. Accountability is essential, and I'm here to make sure that accountability is enforced." James gave him a measured look, not entirely convinced. He knew how these things worked. Once the cameras were gone and the headlines faded, so too would the promises of change. But before he could respond, another voice entered the conversation, one that made the entire room go silent. "Senator, I believe you're overlooking something." James turned to see who had spoken and saw none other than General Thompson himself walking through the dealership's front doors. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as the general strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. His military uniform, crisp and immaculate, only added to the aura of authority that surrounded him. The senator's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised to see the general in person. "General Thompson, I wasn't aware you'd be joining us today." The general's expression remained unreadable as he walked over to where James stood. He didn't acknowledge the senator's comment, his focus entirely on James. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other, no words exchanged but a deep understanding passing between them. The general's presence was a reminder of the bond they shared, the history they had, and the trust that had been built over years of service together. "Carter," the general said, his voice low but filled with the same authority that had carried him through a distinguished military career. "How's everything going here?" James allowed himself a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a bit more complicated than I expected, sir." The general's gaze shifted briefly to the senator, then to Linda and the rest of the dealership staff who were now watching the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and fear. He gave a small nod, as if assessing the situation, before turning back to James. "I made a few calls," the general said casually, though James could tell there was more weight behind those words than he was letting on. wanted to make sure everything was being handled properly. James didn't miss the way Linda stiffened at the general's words, her hands tightening on the counter as though bracing for impact. Carl and Rick, who had been watching from a distance, exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsure of what was coming next. The general turned his attention back to the senator, his voice taking on a sharper tone. "Senator, I believe you were talking about accountability." The senator straightened, clearly uncomfortable, but trying to maintain his composure. "Yes, of course, General. Accountability is key in situations like this." The general's expression remained neutral, but there was a subtle intensity in his gaze that made the senator shift nervously. "Good. Because what I see here is a situation that needs more than just apologies and promises. It needs real action." The senator nodded quickly, eager to agree. "Absolutely, General. That's exactly what I was saying." But the general wasn't finished. He stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Linda. "This dealership has a reputation to maintain, and from what I've seen today, that reputation is on shaky ground." Linda's face drained of color, her earlier confidence completely shattered. "General, I assure you we're doing everything we can to rectify the situation." The general didn't break eye contact. "Are you?" Linda opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. She glanced at the senator for support, but he offered none. The general's presence had shifted the balance of power entirely, and now Linda was left floundering, unable to regain control of the situation. James watched the exchange silently, feeling a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he appreciated the general's support. He always had his back, no matter the situation. But on the other hand, James didn't want to be the reason someone lost their job, or worse. He had come here for respect, not revenge. The general must have sensed James's hesitation because he turned back to him, his expression softening slightly. "Carter, this is your call. What do you want to happen here?" James blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. He hadn't expected the general to put the decision in his hands, but now that it was, he realized that this was the moment where everything could change. He had the power to dictate what happened next, to decide how this story ended. For a long moment, James didn't speak. He looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people watching him, the sales staff, the senator, the news crew, and even the other customers who had stopped to see what all the commotion was about. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about setting a precedent, about making sure that no one else had to go through what he had today. "I don't want anyone to lose their job," James said finally, his voice calm but firm. "But I do want people held accountable for how they treat others. I want respect to mean something. Not just because someone made a phone call, but because it's the right thing to do." The general nodded, clearly satisfied with James's response. He turned back to Linda, his tone sharp once more. "You heard him. Make it happen." Linda nodded quickly, her voice shaking as she replied. "Yes, General. Of course." The senator, sensing that the moment was passing, quickly stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, I want to personally thank you for your service and for standing up for what's right. We need more people like you." James met his gaze, but he didn't respond. The senator's words felt hollow, like everything else he had said that day. This wasn't about politics or public relations, it was about something deeper, something the senator clearly didn't understand. As the general clapped James on the shoulder and the news crew began to pack up their equipment, James realized that the day had finally come to an end. The conflict had reached its peak, and now, with the truth of who he was and what he stood for laid bare, the resolution was in sight. But as James watched the dealership staff scramble to make things right, he knew that the real change would come not from this moment, but from what happened afterward. The spotlight would fade, the cameras would move on, but the lessons learned today would stay with everyone involved. And that, James thought, was more valuable than any car. The tense air in the dealership gradually dissipated as the commotion of the last hour began to settle. The media crew continued to hover near the edges, cameras still rolling as the news crew prepared to film their closing segments. The senator, clearly eager to extract himself from the uncomfortable situation, stepped away to speak with his aides. Linda, Carl, and Rick still lingered in the background, visibly rattled but trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism in the face of the unfolding drama. James stood in the center of it all, a silent observer to the aftermath of the chaos. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't asked for the media, the senator, or the public attention that now swirled around him like a storm. And yet here he was, the the reluctant center of everyone's focus. His face remained impassive, but inside he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had transpired. He had come here to buy a car, but what he'd received was far more than he'd bargained for. As the minutes ticked by, the realization that this wasn't over yet began to settle in. The news crew, eager to capture a dramatic finish to their story, approached James once more, their camera trained on him as the reporter sidled up with her microphone. Her smile was thin, almost predatory, as if she sensed the potential for another powerful soundbite. "Mr. Carter," the reporter began, her voice smooth but laced with anticipation. "We've heard from the senator, from General Thompson, and from the dealership's staff, but I think the public would like to hear from you directly. How do you feel about what's happened today?" James sighed inwardly. He hadn't been looking for a public forum to air his frustrations, but with the cameras rolling and everyone watching, he knew he couldn't simply brush off the question. His thoughts were clear, but the challenge lay in expressing them without further inflaming the situation. He had always preferred action to words, letting his deeds speak for themselves, but now, standing in front of the cameras, he realized that his words would carry weight. He would have to choose them carefully. "I didn't come here looking for attention," James began, his voice calm but steady. "I didn't want any special treatment. All I wanted was to buy a car and be treated with the same respect as any other customer." The reporter nodded, her eyes gleaming as she sensed the direction James was heading. "But that's not what happened, is it?" James hesitated for a brief moment, considering his response. He didn't want to turn this into a spectacle, but the truth was undeniable. "No, that's not what happened," he said finally. "I was judged the moment I walked in here, not based on who I am, but on what I looked like." The reporter's gaze sharpened. "Do you believe you were discriminated against?" James paused, his mind racing as he considered the gravity of the question. The word discrimination carried a heavy weight, and he wasn't eager to use it lightly. He didn't want to label the entire experience as an outright case of racism or prejudice. It was more complex than that. But the reality of what had happened was clear enough. He had been dismissed, underestimated, and treated as less than the other customers in the room, all because of the assumptions people had made about him. "I believe assumptions were made," James said carefully, "and those assumptions led to me being treated unfairly. I don't know what was in the minds of the people who work here, but I do know how their actions made me feel, and I think that's something that needs to change." The reporter, sensing a headline-worthy statement, pressed on, "And do you think this incident will lead to that kind of change?" James gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I hope so. But real change doesn't come from one incident or one news story. It comes from people recognizing their own biases and working to correct them. That's what I want to see." The reporter nodded thoughtfully, clearly pleased with the soundbite she had gotten. She glanced briefly at her cameraman, who gave her a thumbs up, signaling that they had captured enough footage for their segment. She turned back to James with a more genuine smile this time, clearly impressed with his composure and eloquence. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter," she said, extending her hand. James shook it, then watched as the news crew began to pack up their equipment. The cameras were finally being turned off, the lights dimmed, and the buzzing energy of the media presence began to fade. For the first time since he'd arrived at the dealership, James felt a sense of calm starting to return. The public spectacle was finally winding down. Or so he thought. As the media crew exited the dealership, the familiar rumble of a powerful engine echoed from the parking lot. James glanced toward the entrance and saw a large black SUV pull up. His brow furrowed in confusion. He didn't recognize the vehicle, and it certainly didn't belong to any of the dealership's customers. The SUV came to a stop, and after a moment, the doors swung open. Out stepped two uniformed soldiers, their presence immediately commanding attention. They walked toward the entrance with purpose, their eyes scanning the dealership as if assessing a battlefield. Behind them, another figure emerged from the vehicle, a woman in a sharp, military-grade suit, her stride purposeful and confident. James recognized her instantly. Colonel Deborah Harper, another high-ranking officer he had served under during his time in the military. Her reputation preceded her: tough, no-nonsense, and fiercely loyal to those under her command. But what was she doing here? As Colonel Harper approached, the tension in the room returned, though this time it wasn't from the dealership staff or the media. This was something else entirely, a shift in the balance of power that everyone could feel. Linda, Carl, and Rick all exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of the sudden military presence. Even the senator, who had been trying to maintain his composure, looked visibly uncomfortable. "Carter," Colonel Harper said as she approached, her voice sharp but laced with a hint of warmth. "I heard about the situation." James nodded, still unsure of how to respond. "Colonel Harper," he said, acknowledging her with a nod. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here," she replied, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "But General Thompson insisted. He thought it was important that you get the recognition you deserve." James frowned slightly, confused by her words. Recognition. Colonel Harper gestured toward the entrance, where a group of people, civilians and soldiers alike, were beginning to gather. Some of them held cameras, though they weren't members of the media. Others carried banners, flags, and signs that bore words of support and appreciation. James's frown deepened as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just about the car anymore. It had become something much bigger, a public recognition of his service and sacrifice. "General Thompson thought it was time for the public to know who you really are," Colonel Harper said, her voice softening slightly. "Not just a customer trying to buy a car, but a decorated veteran who's given so much for this country." James felt a knot tighten in his chest. He hadn't asked for this. He had never wanted to be singled out or put on a pedestal for his service. To him, serving his country had been a duty, not something that required public praise. But now, as he looked around and saw the growing crowd outside, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. Before he could respond, Colonel Harper gestured toward the SUV, and one of the soldiers opened the back door. From inside, they retrieved a large, ornate wooden box, polished and gleaming in the sunlight. They carried it carefully toward the dealership, placing it on a nearby table with the reverence one might show a sacred artifact. James stared at the box, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what was happening. Colonel Harper stepped forward and opened the box, revealing a gleaming medal resting on a velvet cushion. It was one of the highest honors a soldier could receive, a medal for bravery, awarded only to those who had gone above and beyond the call of duty. James's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the medal. He had been awarded it years ago during one of the most harrowing missions of his career, but he had never expected to see it displayed like this, in a public setting in front of civilians and soldiers alike. Colonel Harper looked at him, her expression softening. "This is who you are, Carter, and it's time the world knows." The knot in James's chest tightened, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. He had always been proud of his service, but he had never sought recognition for it. To him, the medal had been a symbol of the sacrifices he had made alongside his brothers and sisters in arms, a private reminder of the lives saved and the lives lost. But now, standing in front of the crowd, with the weight of the medal and everything it represented laid bare for all to see, James felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort. This wasn't the way he had wanted to be recognized. And yet, as he looked into the faces of the people gathered outside, the soldiers, the civilians, the supporters who had come to honor him, he realized that this wasn't about him anymore. It was about something larger. Colonel Harper stepped aside, allowing James to approach the table where the medal lay. He stared down at it for a long moment, his reflection shimmering in the polished surface of the medal. It felt surreal, like a moment frozen in time. Slowly, he reached out and picked up the medal, feeling its weight in his hands. The medal was cool against his skin, but the significance of the gesture burned hot in his chest. He held it up, turning it over in his hands before looking out at the crowd. The people outside erupted into applause, their cheers ringing out across the parking lot. It wasn't just a recognition of his service, it was a recognition of everything he stood for. The sacrifices, the struggles, the battles fought both on the field and in places like this dealership. It was a moment of public acknowledgement that went far beyond a car purchase. As the applause continued, James felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. For so long, he had carried the weight of his experiences in silence, never seeking recognition or praise. But now, as he stood before the crowd, with the medal in his hands and the knowledge that his story had touched the lives of others, he realized that this moment was about more than just him. It was about all the people who had been underestimated, dismissed, or treated unfairly. It was about the soldiers who had fought beside him, the ones who hadn't come home, and the ones who still carried the weight of their service. It was about respect, something that went beyond appearances, beyond assumptions, and beyond the superficial judgments of others. James lowered the medal, his eyes scanning the crowd, and then he did something he hadn't planned. He turned to Colonel Harper and handed the medal back to her. "I didn't come here for this," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't need the recognition. What I needed was respect. Colonel Harper met his gaze, her expression softening with understanding. She nodded, accepting the medal and placing it back in the box. The applause continued, but now it felt different. It wasn't just for the medal or the public recognition, it was for the man standing before them, the man who had stood up for himself and for others, not through force or fame, but through quiet dignity. As the crowd continued to cheer, James turned and walked back toward the dealership, leaving the public recognition behind. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was time to move forward. As the applause outside the dealership slowly subsided, James walked back inside, his mind buzzing with the whirlwind of emotions the day had thrown at him. The weight of the recognition he had just received was still heavy in his chest, though not because of the medal itself, it was what it represented. Respect, fairness, dignity, these were things he had always fought for, both in his military service and in everyday life. But now, standing in the cool, polished interior of the dealership, he realized that the conflict wasn't just external. It was an internal struggle as well. James had never sought the spotlight, and the events of today had pushed him far outside of his comfort zone. He had been thrown into the public eye, not because of his service, but because of the assumptions people had made about him. In a way, the medal, the crowd, and the applause felt disconnected from the real issue that had brought him here. It wasn't recognition that he had sought, it was a simple act of fairness. As he re-entered the dealership, the atmosphere had shifted once again. The tension that had defined the earlier hours was still present, but it had taken on a different quality. The staff, who had been dismissive or condescending when he first arrived, now seemed unsure of how to behave. They hovered at a distance, unsure whether to approach him or to keep their heads down. Linda, the manager, was standing by the front desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face still pale with anxiety. James didn't need to say anything to know what they were thinking. The presence of the senator, the media, and then Colonel Harper had completely upended their expectations. What had started as a routine car sale had spiraled into something far larger, a confrontation about respect, fairness, and accountability. And now, with the eyes of the public still on the dealership, they had no choice but to confront their own actions. Linda approached James cautiously, her expression one of forced calm. The earlier bravado she had shown when trying to steer him away from the convertible was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of professionalism that barely masked her discomfort. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice tentative, "I just want to apologize once again for everything that happened today. It wasn't our intention to make you feel unwelcome." James nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. He had heard enough apologies that day to last a lifetime, and he knew that they were only being given because the situation had escalated beyond anyone's control. Linda, Carl, Rick, they were all reacting to the pressure, not because they had genuinely changed their attitudes, but because they had no choice. "It's not about feeling unwelcome," James said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "It's about being treated with the same respect as everyone else." Linda swallowed hard, clearly unsure of how to respond. She glanced briefly at Carl and Rick, who were standing off to the side, looking equally uncomfortable. They had been the ones to dismiss James from the beginning, assuming that he couldn't afford the car, or worse, that he didn't belong in the dealership at all. Now, with the full weight of the day's events pressing down on them, they had no choice but to acknowledge their mistakes. "I understand," Linda said, though her voice wavered slightly, "and I assure you we're going to take steps to make sure something like this never happens again." James raised an eyebrow, skeptical. He had heard similar promises before, from other places, other people, and while he appreciated the sentiment, he knew that real change wasn't something that could be accomplished with a few words. It took time, effort, and a genuine commitment to do better. "I hope you mean that," James said after a long pause. "Because this isn't just about today, it's about how people are treated, no matter where they come from or what they look like." Linda nodded quickly, her face flushed with the pressure of the moment. "We do. We will. I'll personally make sure that our staff undergoes the necessary training to ensure that we treat all of our customers with the respect they deserve." James didn't respond right away. He could see that Linda was trying, but he also knew that promises made under pressure often faded once the spotlight was gone. Still, he wasn't here to destroy anyone's career or to hold a grudge. What mattered to him was that they learned from this experience, that they understood the impact of their actions and made a real effort to change. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's day," James said quietly, his voice calm but resolute. "I just want to make sure that the next person who walks through those doors doesn't have to go through what I did today." Linda nodded again, relief flickering across her face. "Absolutely, Mr. Carter. We'll do everything we can to make sure that happens." The tension in the room seemed to ease slightly, though it was clear that the weight of the situation still hung over everyone. Carl and Rick exchanged another uneasy glance, clearly uncomfortable with how things had turned out. They had been caught in the act, so to speak, and now they had no choice but to confront the consequences of their behavior. James turned to Carl and Rick, his gaze steady. "You both made some assumptions about me today," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I want you to think about why." Carl shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smugness completely gone. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. I didn't mean to. I didn't realize who you were." James held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "It's not about who I am. It's about how you treat people. You didn't know anything about me, but you decided that I wasn't worth your time because of the way I looked. That's the problem." Rick, who had been silent for most of the interaction, finally spoke up, his voice quiet and uncertain. "We didn't mean any disrespect, Mr. Carter. It was just a misunderstanding." James shook his head, his expression still calm but resolute. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. You chose to judge me before you knew anything about me, and that's something you need to think about." The two salesmen nodded, clearly chastened. They were no longer the confident, dismissive figures they had been earlier. Now they stood before James, humbled and aware of their mistakes. It wasn't often that people like them were forced to confront their own biases, but today had been an eye-opener. "I hope you both learn from this," James said, his voice softening slightly. "Because respect isn't something you give only when it's convenient. It's something you give to everyone, no matter who they are." There was a long moment of silence as Carl and Rick absorbed James's words. They looked genuinely remorseful, though James knew that only time would tell if they truly understood the lesson. Linda, sensing that the tension had finally begun to dissipate, stepped forward once again. "Mr. Carter, I want to personally thank you for your patience today. And I want to assure you that we'll be offering you a special discount on the car you've chosen as a way of making up for everything that happened." James raised an eyebrow, surprised by the offer. He hadn't come here looking for a discount, and he certainly hadn't expected one after everything that had happened. But he understood that the dealership was trying to save face, to make amends for the way they had treated him. "I appreciate the gesture," James said after a moment, "but I didn't come here for a discount. I came here to buy a car and to be treated with respect. That's all I wanted." Linda nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Carter, we understand. But we still want to make sure you leave here knowing that we value your business." James glanced at the car, the convertible he had set his sights on from the moment he walked into the dealership. It was still there, gleaming under the showroom lights, a symbol of the day's events. But now, after everything that had happened, it felt different. The car was no longer just a goal, it had become a symbol of something much larger. Respect, fairness, dignity. These were the things James had fought for, not just today, but throughout his entire life. After a long pause, James nodded. "All right," he said finally. "Let's finish this." The relief on Linda's face was palpable. She quickly gestured for Carl to retrieve the necessary paperwork, eager to complete the transaction and bring an end to the day's events. As Carl hurried away, James took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his body slowly begin to unwind. The conflict, which had started as a small spark of disrespect, had grown into a firestorm of public attention and accountability. But now it seemed that the storm was finally beginning to pass. As the paperwork was completed, James signed his name on the dotted line, his mind still buzzing with the weight of the day's events. He had come here for something simple, but what he had gotten was far more complicated. Yet, as he looked at the keys to his new car, resting in his hand, he felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't about the car itself, it was about the principle. He had stood his ground, demanded respect, and refused to be dismissed or underestimated. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Linda handed him the keys with a nervous smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. I hope you enjoy the car." James nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The car was nice, sure, but it wasn't what he had been fighting for. The real victory today was in the change that had taken place not just in the dealership, but in the minds of the people who had witnessed the events unfold. Respect wasn't something you could buy or sell, it was something you could buy or sell, it was something you had to earn, and something you had to give freely to others. As James walked out of the dealership, the weight of the day slowly lifting from his shoulders, he glanced back one last time. The media crew was gone, the senator had left, and the crowd that had gathered outside had dispersed. But the lessons learned today would remain, and that, in the end, was what truly mattered. James opened the door to his new convertible, slid into the driver's seat, and took a deep breath. The engine roared to life beneath him, a low, powerful hum that filled the quiet parking lot. He looked out at the road ahead, knowing that this moment was more than just the culmination of a difficult day, it was the beginning of something new. With a quiet smile, James shifted the car into gear and drove away, leaving the dealership behind him. The road stretched out before him, wide and open, and as the wind rushed through the open roof of the convertible, he felt a sense of freedom that had nothing to do with the car itself. It was the freedom that came with standing up for what was right, with demanding respect not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been dismissed or underestimated. And as the dealership faded into the distance behind him, James knew that today had been more than just a battle for a car, it had been a battle for something far greater. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon as James Carter drove down the highway in his new convertible, the wind rushing past him. The road stretched out ahead, wide and clear, framed by the soft glow of the setting sun. It was the kind of moment that should have felt triumphant, a man driving off in the car of his dreams after a long, hard-fought battle. But for James, it wasn't the car that occupied his thoughts as he sped away from the dealership. It was everything that had led up to this moment, everything he had faced, and the lessons he had learned along the way. As the miles passed beneath the tires, James reflected on the events of the day. What had started as a simple trip to buy a car had turned into something far more significant, something that went beyond a mere transaction. It had become a confrontation with the very assumptions and biases that still plagued society, a battle for dignity and respect in a world that often judged people by the way they looked, rather than who they truly were. James had never wanted to be a symbol of anything, let alone a public figure in a debate about fairness and equality. His life had always been about service, about doing the right thing without the need for recognition or praise. He had served his country with honor, not for the medals or the accolades, but because it was his duty, because he believed in something greater than himself. But today had been different. Today, the battle had been personal, and in some ways that had made it even harder. It wasn't about fighting an enemy on a distant battlefield. It was about standing up for himself, for his right to be treated with the same respect as anyone else, regardless of how he looked or what assumptions people made about him. As he drove, James thought about Linda, Carl, and Rick, the dealership employees who had been at the heart of the conflict. He had seen the fear and discomfort in their eyes as the situation escalated, but more than that, he had seen the subtle change in them by the end of the day. They had been forced to confront their own biases, to reckon with the fact that they had judged him without even knowing who he was. Would they change? James didn't know for sure, but he hoped so. The day had been a lesson for them, just as it had been for him. Change didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come from a single confrontation. But it had to start somewhere, and today had been that start. James glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as the dealership grew smaller and smaller behind him until it finally disappeared from sight. He didn't feel anger or bitterness toward the people who had underestimated him. What he felt was a quiet resolve, a sense of purpose that had been with him since his days in the military. Respect wasn't something that could be demanded, it had to be earned. But it was also something that everyone deserved, no matter who they were or where they came from. The events of the day had reminded James of something he had always known deep down: people were often too quick to judge, too quick to make assumptions about others based on their appearance, their clothes, or the way they spoke. It was a part of human nature, but that didn't mean it couldn't be challenged, couldn't be changed. Respect wasn't just about being polite or offering a smile. It was about seeing people for who they truly were, beyond the surface, beyond the assumptions, and that was a lesson the world still needed to learn. The car hummed beneath him, smooth and powerful, as James continued down the highway. The open road stretched out before him, and with it came a sense of freedom that wasn't just about the car itself, but about the choices he had made today. He could have walked away from the dealership, could have allowed himself to be pushed aside, dismissed, and ignored. But he hadn't. He had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. In the rearview mirror, James could still picture the faces of the people at the dealership, the way their expressions had changed as the day wore on. They had learned something today, even if they didn't fully realize it yet. They had learned that respect wasn't something that could be given based on appearances or assumptions. It was something that had to be earned and given freely, without prejudice or bias. As the wind whipped through his hair and the sound of the engine filled his ears, James allowed himself to relax for the first time that day. He had done what needed to be done, and now, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, he could finally put the day behind him. But the lessons of the day would stay with him, just as they would stay with the people who had witnessed it all unfold. The media might move on to the next big story. The senator might go back to his office and forget about the day's events, and the dealership staff might eventually return to their normal routines. But what had happened today mattered. It mattered because it was a reminder that every person, no matter their background, deserved to be seen, to be heard, and to be treated with dignity. James thought about the general, about the phone call that had set everything in motion. He hadn't asked for the general's help, but in the end, it had been a blessing. The general had forced the issue, had made sure that James was treated fairly, but more than that, he had made sure that the world saw what was really happening. It wasn't just about one man trying to buy a car, it was about something much bigger. As the highway stretched out before him, James allowed himself to think about what came next. The road ahead was open, filled with possibilities, but he knew that the real journey wasn't the one he was on right now. The real journey was the one he had been on his entire life, the journey toward a world where respect was given freely, where people were judged by their character, not by their appearance. The car purred beneath him as he shifted gears, the wind rushing through the open roof. James smiled to himself, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He had done what needed to be done today. He had stood up for himself, had demanded respect, and in doing so, had helped others see the importance of treating people with dignity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road, James felt a sense of closure. The battle was over, but the fight for respect, for fairness, for dignity, that was a fight that would never truly end. It was a fight that people would have to continue day in and day out in every interaction, in every judgment they made about others. But for now, James had done his part, and as he drove off into the fading light, he knew that today had been more than just a victory for him. It had been a victory for everyone who believed in a world where respect was earned, not based on assumptions or appearances, but on who a person truly was. The moral of the story was clear: respect isn't something that can be given out of fear or obligation. It's not something that should be reserved for the wealthy, the powerful, or the well-dressed. Respect is something that every person deserves, regardless of their background, their appearance, or their status. And when we judge people by anything other than their character, we fail to see the true worth of the individual standing before us. James Carter's story wasn't just about buying a car, it was about standing up for what was right. It was about challenging the assumptions and biases that too often shape our interactions with others. And it was about reminding the world that respect is something we all deserve, something that must be earned and given freely, without judgment or prejudice. As James drove off into the twilight, the lesson of the day remained clear in his mind. The battle for respect was never truly over. It was a fight that had to be fought every day, in every interaction, in every choice we made about how we treated others. And in the end, that was what mattered most.